The day he returned to the town he had once sworn never to see again began with silence so heavy it felt louder than gunfire, the kind of silence that presses against the chest and reminds a man of everything he ran from. And as he stepped off his horse in front of the weather-worn farmhouse where he'd grown up, dressed in dust and years of regret, the only thought echoing in his mind was that he had come back too late, because his mother was already gone, buried 2 days earlier under the wide-open sky she loved, and all that remained was unfinished business and a pain he didn't know how to carry. The funeral was over, the neighbors had returned to their routines, and yet something pulled him toward the porch where a woman stood holding a simple wicker basket filled with jars of preserves, her posture steady but her eyes tired in a way that told a whole story before she spoke, and when their gazes met it was as if time hesitated, because he recognized her instantly even though years had passed, the quiet girl from the neighboring land who used to bring bread every winter, now a woman shaped by responsibility and restraint. And when she offered him the basket and said softly that his mother had asked her to deliver it if he ever returned, his throat tightened in a way no battlefield ever managed to do. He took the basket like it weighed more than iron, noticing the careful way each jar was labeled in his mother's handwriting, small notes tucked between them with reminders and recipes and blessings, and in that moment he realized his mother had never stopped believing he'd come back, never stopped preparing for a future he himself had given up on. And as the woman explained how she had stayed behind to help during the illness, how nights were long and medicine scarce and hope thinner than the winter air, he listened without interrupting, shame rising with every word, because while he had been out chasing freedom and running from expectations, these two women had been holding the world together in quiet ways no one ever praised. He stayed at the house that night, sleeping in his childhood room, the walls still bearing marks of growing years, and every creak of the floor sounded like a memory accusing him. But it was the basket on the table that finally broke him open when he found the last jar at the bottom with a note that read simply, "For when you're ready to come home," and something inside him cracked, not loudly, but deeply, the way earth splits to make room for new roots. Days passed and he didn't leave, helping fix fences, mending what time and neglect had worn down, and the woman, who carried grief with grace and spoke with honesty, became his anchor, not through grand gestures but through shared silences and simple meals. And slowly he learned she had lost more than he knew, had been promised a future that never arrived, had chosen duty over dreams because someone had to, and that someone had always been her. The town watched quietly as the man who once left with fire in his eyes began to soften, began to listen, began to belong again, and when whispers surfaced about selling the land, about moving on, he surprised everyone by standing firm, saying this place mattered, that some roots were worth protecting even if they grew from pain. And one evening as the sun bled gold across the fields, he admitted aloud what he'd never said before, that he was afraid to stay because staying meant facing who he'd been and who he failed to be. And she answered with a truth just as raw, that leaving isn't bravery when it's driven by fear, and for the first time he understood that courage wasn't found in distance but in presence. The turning point came when a storm rolled in fierce and unforgiving, threatening the crops and the house alike. And as they worked side by side to secure what little they could, he saw his mother in her movements, in her strength, and realized that love had been quietly guiding him back all along, not to punish him, but to give him another chance. And when the storm finally passed, leaving the land scarred but standing, he knew his decision had already been made. Months later, as the seasons changed and laughter returned to the porch, he stood where he once arrived broken, now grounded, watching the woman place a fresh basket on the table, this one filled not with memories but with plans. And as he took her hand he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because the past had been erased, but because it had been accepted. And at his mother's grave the next morning, he spoke words he'd held back too long, promising not perfection but presence, promising to stay, promising to love the way she taught him to, quietly and completely. And as the wind moved through the grass like a gentle answer, he understood that returning for a funeral had given him a life. That what he found wasn't loss alone but purpose, and that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't land or legacy, but the courage to come home and finally become the man someone always believed you could be.